Hey, so where we left off last time, we had a huge debate or a huge back and forth going on between President Andrew Johnson and the radical Republican group of Congress, and both sides were trying to dictate the terms of Reconstruction because remember, there is nowhere in the Constitution that talks about who has power when regarding to admitting a new state back into the Union. And from this, we have different plans coming forth. We have the president's plan under Andrew Johnson, which was very lenient in trying to just bring back as many southern states as quickly as possible. And then we had the radical Republicans, which was trying to make sure that they protected the rights of the freed black men over the rights of the white Southerners who were trying to restrict those rights. And we left off with these military zones that were created, where basically the United States military would go into southern states to enforce and make sure black codes were not being followed, to make sure that the Black Americans were getting equal rights under these acts, and that the 13th and 14th Amendments were being followed. And President Johnson is going to try to keep these military zones from being created or being followed or being used as much as possible. And what he's going to do is by firing military generals to a point that were appointed by Congress to make it as hard for them to do this as much as possible. But for Andrew Johnson, unfortunately, he violates this new law called the Tenure of Office Act. And this Tenure of Office Act essentially comes out of President Andrew Jackson's presidency, where we talked about the spoils system. And with the spoils system, remember Andrew Jackson tried to just fire everybody in Washington and just appoint his own new buddies that were loyal to him, kind of as a pro quo type of thing, and during his presidency for helping support him get to office. This Tenure of Office Act essentially tries to stop the spoils system. It allows, kind of keeps the presidents from just having absolute authority to fire anybody that has acquired tenure from this. And what the radical Republicans are going to do is give us as an opportunity to impeach Andrew Johnson by violating the Office of Tenure Act. And the way that the Constitution works, hopefully you remember this from your civics classes last year, is that the House has the ability to bring up on criminal charges the right of impeachment. And we see here under the slide is that the House votes 126 to 47 to charge Andrew Johnson with a crime. However, impeachment is not enough. The House has the ability to impeach, but the Senate has to remove. And after an 11-week trial, the Senate falls one vote short of removing President Andrew Johnson from the presidency, and he would have been the first and only president removed from office. However, he will not be the only one to be impeached, and we'll get to that a lot later towards the end of this, end of the year. But Johnson was able to successfully argue that he had not committed a high crime or misdemeanor, and the Senate was able to keep him in office by, again, like I said, one vote. So moving forward, then under 1868, Reconstruction has not been moving very swiftly. Really, the only state so far that has been admitted had been Tennessee. But in 1868, Ulysses Grant is going to win the presidency, and Andrew Johnson will not even be represented by the Democratic Party. And Ulysses Grant will win very overwhelmingly. We can see here the vote 73 to 27% in the electoral vote. And you can see the southern states who did not vote because they had not been readmitted yet. And under President Grant, he is going to work with Congress to enforce Reconstruction more under the Reconstruction plans of the Wade Davis bill and the Congressional Reconstruction. He is going to enforce the military action in the military zones, and he's going to use military action to kind of squash down the newly upstanding KKK that is popping up as a terrorist group in the southern states. He is also, by 1870, is going to be able to get all of the states readmitted into the Union. We can see here on the graph, Texas, Georgia, and Virginia will be the last ones to be occupied or to be able to be brought back into the United States. So again, by 1870, all southern states will be readmitted back into the Union under President Grant. So even though President Grant is going to have a successful presidency in the eyes of Reconstruction and getting all of the states to be readmitted back into the Union, his presidency, both terms, are going to be more kind of plagued by a series of corruption and growth under the federal branch, under people that have worked for him, that we had not really seen in quite some time. And one of those is going to be the credit mobilizer scandal, which involves the Transcontinental Railroad being constructed, where creditors were basically giving bribes to congressmen for this. The whiskey ring as well, which was tax on whiskey, was not being enforced, and whiskey distillers were again bribing bribing government officials to basically not have to collect the taxes, and another event with the Indian ring, same kind of thing, kind of showing the corruption and bribery that was taking place in the federal government under the executive branch. And all of these are going to make Grant look very, very poorly, as even though he was not directly tied to any of these, and there's no evidence of him being a part of them. They happened under his watch, and it really kind of puts a plague over his presidency moving forward historically. One of the last thing as far as his presidency in 1870, I'm sorry, is that the 15th Amendment is going to be passed. So we finally have our all three of our Reconstruction amendments between the 13th, 14th, and 15th. And with the 15th, it gives all black men the right to vote. This is going to be pushed forward in 1870. So from here now we have the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to new slaves, and the 15th Amendment, which guarantees voting rights to African Americans. So all of these Reconstruction amendments are really trying to put forward and promote equality for the newly freed black men in the South after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And from this, we start to see a new band of black politicians who are elected to state and federal government offices here. And we can see kind of the famous picture of the black representatives in the first House in 1870 that are elected. So then looking here at the congressional Reconstruction, African Americans' rights had improved very, very much so. Literacy and education were increasing. Their marriages were recognized by the states. They were legally allowed to work, and they were able to really kind of experience a lot of the same equal rights that were held to by whites and blacks alike. During this time period, also, Reconstruction is going to kind of bring a new bout of economics to the South. We talked about before how under the American system, the South was more based on cash crops, things like tobacco and cotton and so forth. And we're going to see now more of a more diverse economic industry where we have textile mills, iron, steel mills as well. Again, still not as much as in the North, but they are diversifying a lot more so than they were prior to the Civil War. And the government is going to use railroads and to help kind of repair and rebuild the South. Remember, during Total War under Sherman, a lot of the southern cities, especially the major ones like Atlanta, were destroyed and need to be repaired and rebuilt. So it seems that by 1870, Reconstruction had been pretty much a success. We already talked about some of the advancements that were happening for black men in the South. And during Reconstruction, all 11 states had been readmitted into the Union, so there's no more divide between Confederacy and Union. And all 13, 14, and 15th Amendments are guaranteed in those states. However, we're going to see that over the next couple of years in the 1870s, Democrats will slowly take back control of southern states, and once they do that, using newly founded black codes and anti-discrimination laws and so forth that are put forth in place, they start to really kind of bind the rights and the freedoms of the Southerners, of the African Americans in the southern states. They make it very, very difficult to vote. They basically testify against whites. They make it illegal to testify against whites in courts or marrying people who are white or even of owning lands. These laws will often kind of restrict black workers from gaining skilled jobs or kind of outcompeting against white workers in these jobs. Black men could then be also forced into slavery, kind of what we would think more of like an indentured servitude as punishment for a crime for not paying back debts. So again, these rights are being taken away, and a lot of them are being held up by the Supreme Court during this time period. And if we look here, there are three key dates. There's three key cases that are going to kind of enshrine these black codes, these discrimination laws that are being put forth in the southern states. And one of those, the first one, the slaughterhouse cases, which goes forth and kind of dismantles the 14th Amendment by saying that the rights are guaranteed more by the state, not the federal power. So if the states want to take away those rights, the 14th Amendment really does nothing. Again, then we see in 1876, the 14th Amendment, the cry is that it's more about not punishing the whites who oppress the blacks. And then by 1876, the 15th Amendment was determined to not grant voting rights to anybody, but rather restrict types of voter discrimination. And that's going to be key when we look at examples of voter discrimination, where they will make literacy tests and different types of tests to make sure that blacks in the South were not able to vote. And then in the 1870s, the newly formed Ku Klux Klan is going to be created as a way to kind of use violence and intimidation to keep blacks from possessing the same rights as those, and really kind of challenge the white supremacy. We see lynchings becoming more common. And under these states, or during the 1870s, a lot of the state support will return back to the Democratic Party, which will still be pushing forward the ideas of segregation and discrimination against newly freed blacks after the Civil War. One of the major reasons for this then is also going to be because black voting was almost eliminated for a number of reasons, either from fear, intimidation, taxing, having black codes kind of put forth literacy tests and so forth to try to make it as impossible as possible to get these people to be able to vote at the polls. And one by one, what we're going to tend to see is over the course of the 1870s is that these states are falling from Republican tickets to eventually become Democratic tickets. And the Democratic Party at this point is pushing for the idea of kind of reinstituting discrimination as much as possible, because remember, back before the Civil War, the Democratic Party was a pro-slavery party. So even though the Civil War had ended slavery, many African Americans were still struggling in the South because of the discriminatory laws. They had very little job training and they were making very little money. Most are returning to some sort of plantation style work because that is what they are skilled in, that's what they are trained in, and there's no other really opportunities being provided to them in the southern states. So one of the kind of lifestyles that is being promoted here in the South during this time period is going to be called the sharecropping. And one of the ways we can kind of think about what sharecropping is, it's very similar to that of the serfs during the Middle Ages that we talk about in world history, with living on the manor systems, where essentially you are working for the Lord, and they are giving you certain protections, but also you're not really having a chance for advancement. You're essentially a servant to them and working on their fields in return for giving them their crops. And we can see the same thing here. As a sharecropper, you're given a piece of land that is owned by a white aristocrat, a rich white person in the South. And as a sharecropper, you promise to work on the land. In exchange, you will give him half of what you tend to. You also buy things from the aristocrats, so you're giving him profit from that as well. You do the labor, you harvest, you plant, and you reap the crops as well. And then when it comes time to sell, you get half the earnings. However, by the time you sell everything and then also buy what you need to support you and your family, you essentially have very little money left over, and it kind of keeps you enshrined in poverty. And a lot of these people who are these sharecroppers are very low educated, so they're not able to kind of work for a better system. They're not able to push for better working rights. They're not able to find better jobs, whether in factories or moving northward anywhere else. So they're kind of ensconced in this cycle of extreme poverty. So definitely by the mid 1870s, the Democratic Party had returned to power in most of these southern states, and they were the ones typically winning elections. And because of that, the only things that were in place protecting the newly freed blacks, as we can see in this picture here, is the federal troops. The Southern Democrats were basically creating a second-class citizen from the black Americans of the South that had been newly freed. And kind of fast forwarding to 1876, the reason why this is an important election is by looking at the electoral vote, neither the Democrat Tilden or the Republican Hayes had won a majority of the Electoral College votes. And from this, we're going to get the Compromise of 1877. And from this, essentially what takes place is that Democrats agree to vote for they agree to vote for Hayes as president as long as federal troops are removed from the South. So what this essentially does, it ends Reconstruction. President Hayes will become the next president, the 19th president of the United States, and Reconstruction is officially ended because the troops are removed from the southern states, and each southern state is allowed to dictate how they want to run their states as far as treating the southern blacks who have been protected by these. And from this, we get what's called the Jim Crow era, which we will continue to talk about as we move all the way into the Civil Rights Act during the 20th century, 1900s. And the Jim Crow laws are going to be these segregation laws that restrict blacks from different things in societies, whether it is creating separate fountains, creating separate schools, having certain voting places or literacy tests to vote in general. And it creates really very difficult for blacks to have equal rights in the South during this time period. And the legacy of these laws, again, are going to be moving forward all the way until the Civil Rights Movement, which we'll get to then a couple units from now. So it's really kind of stuck in this place where even though blacks have their citizenship and they are supposed to be equals, there is definitely not a time period of equality in these states who kind of abide by these Jim Crow laws. All right, so thanks guys for listening. Make sure to come back with any kind of questions, and we will go over Reconstruction here the next couple classes and make sure we're good to go before Christmas break.